That happens to be what I'm going to call leaf number 2. So we go to 948, 102 for the node ID, and this will be leaf number. Now, as I'm doing this, again, you're seeing the addresses be populated, and I'm also going to see this pod be built. Once I take a detected switch and I've accepted it in my fabric, I'll see it add to my pod. So I'll keep that expanded there so we can see that grow. Here, this guy here is 101, corresponds to leaf 1. And again, the only reason why I'm bringing up the serial number, and it's not a requirement, I just like to know which specific physical switch I'm going to tag as, 101 or leaf number 1, 2, and 3, just to keep it straight for my documentation purposes. And this guy's going to be 105. All right, MAD is 103. Leaf 3. BU4 is going to be leaf number 5. So it'll be 105. Apologize, we do have quite a few switches here. We do see a lot of customers, only have 2 leaves and 2 spines, or start small and grow. This is one of our TAC labs, so it's a little bit larger than some of the other fabrics you might see. So last but not least here, who am I missing? Looks like 2, I've got 3, looks like 4. So 104 is my missing one. 104, oh, keep clicking off. 104 and leaf 4. Now I'm going to pause there for a second. I'm going to go back to my console here, and I'm actually going to connect to leaf number 4. So as you can see here, I just want to highlight something. I'm going to close that other one. I don't want him anymore. So as you can see, I've got no name here. This is leaf number 4's console. Nothing's happening. I don't have a login for yet. I'm going to go ahead and add leaf 4, my very last one here. I'm going to add it to my fabric. And again, I'm going to give it a sec because it is doing a bit of processing in the back. I'm doing that DHCP. I'm getting the address, adding it to my fabric, working all that out. You can see up here, even though I've just clicked add, it hasn't yet shown up in my pod. So it's still doing its, its back-end processes. In a second here, I should see it pop up between leaf 3 and leaf 5 here. So I'll give that a second to happen. But if I go back to my console, let's see if it's detected yet. So I just hit enter. Now I've got my leaf name. So assuming that, it's still probably going through the process, but if it's pushed the user account, I can go ahead and log in with the same admin account I logged in with my APIC. So now I can log in here. Show Llvp neighbors. A lot of great commands I can do here. So I can see all the neighbors you can see, kind of the ones that we were looking at. I can see which interfaces. All right, so what else do we have to do? Well, we've got a couple other APICs we have to add here. So I'm going to add, for time's sake, I'm just going to add one more APIC. So I'm going to go to another guy here. This is APIC number 2. So I need his SIM-CIP. That's what I want. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and log in. These are all the default passwords and usernames for CIMC, just admin and password if you haven't yet configured any specific user accounts. Okay, opening them up. So I'm only going to do the second one here. I won't worry about the third one just for time considerations. Got to accept all the lovely Java updates. So we just booted this guy up. Again, he hasn't been configured, so I'm just going to walk through it very quickly here because I've kind of talked to the points already. So I'm going to go ahead and just configure his management IP will be really the only thing that's going to be different. So this guy's management IP is going to be 178 and will be a /24 as well. So I'm going to keep the same fabric name. I'm going to see controllers. This guy's ID is going to be number 2, and that's important. So it's going to default the name to APIC2. I'm going to keep the same tunnel endpoint address pool. 4093 for the infrastructure VLAN. Again, keeping the details the same. And then I got to configure the address here. 178/24. Give it the gateway. And we're done. Okay? So now if I jump back over to my APIC UI, my user interface, and I go back to my System tab, I should see that second controller coming into view here. So if I kind of expand this out here, give it a second, it has to boot up here, I should see another controller pop up here in a sec after it finishes booting. So I'll keep that up there. Give it some time, and it'll pop up in here and then fully. So the health state will start syncing up with the active APIC. It'll share the configuration. So everything I've configured so far, I won't have to replicate. Okay, it's going to do that for me. So looking in here, you can see if there's any problems with an APIC controller. You can see if you want to change the clustering size, I can do so here. I can, go bigger if I want to add a few more. Let's take a look at some of the very important things. So other important things we want to do on a Fabric bring-up is, like I said, NTP is very important. So if we come into our Fabric tab, into our Fabric policies, there's a lot of policies here that apply globally to my entire pod here. So I'm going to configure, like I said, NTP is very important because we're going to use a lot of counters and metrics for judging delay, congestion. So it's very important that all of our devices are referencing the same time source. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into create an NTP policy. Okay, so if I come into my pod policies for the pod, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new policy here. So I'm going to create a time and date policy. And I'm going to call this San Jose Time Pol. And I'm not going to worry about authentication. Next thing it's going to ask me is for some time sources. Okay, so here's where I would put in the IP address of my time sources. And I'd probably recommend that you use IP addresses. Don't rely on DNS for a time source, just in case we have a type of problem. 108.15. And one of them, you're going to probably want to set them as preferred. So the first guy here, I'm going to set them as preferred. Now, managing EPGs. If I had both management configured for out of band, which we did configure that, this is the source I want to pull that time source from. If I wanted to use in-band management go through my Fabric, so perhaps I had an NTP server connected to a leaf rather than an out-of-band management network, I would go change that to in-band. So we're going to keep on our out-of-band management network. We know they got that configured. And you'd probably want to add at least a couple different time sources. Okay, so I only have one there. That's perfectly fine. If you have two, even better. Next thing we want to do is add these to our policy group. So we got to make a policy group for this particular time source. So I'm going to call this pod. So again, everything in ACI is built on policy. Even though I've just configured this NTP time policy, I haven't really attached it to a group of policies that are going to be applied. That's kind of one individual setting, and I want to create a policy which is going to be a bunch of settings. So I'm going to call this my San Jose policy group because I can have time here, I can have communication policies, SNMP, all be part of this greater policy group. So we just think of a policy group as a collection of policies. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and really the only one I'm going to set for now is just that time and date. Okay, so that's been applied. Now that's going to set my time source for all of my switches. Now if you ever want to configure it or confirm it, we should be able to look at that from our leaf here. Yeah, the policy may not be pushed yet. Let's have a look if it's on our APICs. So I prefer going to the SSH for the APICs. I find it a little bit quicker, just like you will on any kind of command line. So if you did want to validate and make sure that your configuration was pushed for the time source, assuming that's a valid address, I'm just kind of threw one in there. I'm hoping it's active. MPT stat. So it's not running right now. So odds are my IP address here that I've kind of dummied up here is not valid. If you put a real address there, it's going to tell you the delay, if you have a preferred source, and what the any latency between your time sources. So make sure you set up a valid one and at least put two of them for redundancy. So this guy here is probably an old legacy one. Proves my point, you definitely want to have at least two in your system here. So for our lab, we only have the one there, but you definitely, for any type of production, you want to have at least a couple. The only other couple things I want to kind of show what you do on kind of the first couple hours of setting up a fabric is also want to set up a fabric policy for your exporting. So when I want to export either my configuration, as you start deploying policies, you want to back it up. I don't want to lose anything. So underneath of my admin tab, if I come into import and export, again, everything is set up as policy. So I don't configure just a configuration backup policy. First, I'm going to configure my remote location because I might reuse my remote location for backing up my configuration. I might use it for exporting tech support information as well. So there's multiple uses here. So I might call this my San Jose FTP server. I would go ahead and put in an address for it. Select your protocol. You know, I can put in a path if I have a path, or I can put in the root, put in your username, your password, and then again, which method do I want to contact it through, the out-of-band network or through the fabric? So we're going to keep the out-of-band because all my management connectivity is going out-of-band at this point. Okay, and I've got that configured. So look, I haven't actually configured it, said, what am I going to export to that FTP server? I've just called it a remote location. So now I'm going to set up a policy here for exporting my configuration. So one of my policies I can create here is called a configuration export policy. And again, even though I don't have very much configuration, set this up on day one so you've got that in place. So when you do start adding tenants, policies, and applications, that they're being backed up. So if you have a problem and you got to re-import your config, it's all set to go. So I'm going to call this a daily backup. You can use two formats of the export file. I can either use JSON or an XML. It doesn't matter. We can import both, so keep the default if you like. The only other thing I really want to worry about is my scheduler. So I don't have a schedule of how often I want to do this, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new schedule. I'm going to call this a daily schedule. I want it to run every day at, say, midnight. So I'm going to make this recurring. I'm just going to make a very simple schedule here to call it midnight. It's going to happen every day at 0 hours, 0 minute, which is midnight. If I want to limit the amount of nodes that it can pull configuration from at once, I could set that up here. I'm not too concerned because configuration is really only from my Apex. Okay, so I've got my schedule, and you can see that when I'm creating these policies, such as my configuration export policy, it's led me into also creating a scheduler. So they're not mutually exclusive. I can reuse this new schedule for other things. Perhaps I want to export my tech support information daily. I could bind it to the same type of schedule. Okay, and then I'm going to say, well, where do I want this to go? Well, I want it to use my remote location that I've just configured. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So now every day at midnight, this is going to automatically back up my configuration to my FTP server. The only other thing I'll probably look at very quickly, which is a best practice in lieu of time, is when you're creating your firmware policies. And the reason I want to bring it up is because it's important that we have redundancy, and we don't want to take down our whole fabric when we're doing an upgrade. So we have two pieces of our fabric firmware. One is called a firmware group, which allows me to set a version of firmware. The other one is how and when do I want to upgrade them? Do I want to upgrade them all at once, or do I want to do them in pairs, or in a controlled manner? So typically what we do is you're normally going to want your nodes to all have the same version. So I'm going to create a firmware group called all nodes. If I had a version here, which I don't have any firmware uploaded to it right now, just what's running on it, and I can put in my node ID. So I can actually go 201 all the way to 204, and that would include every single node. So I can't apply this policy because I actually haven't uploaded any firmware to it. But typically you want one firmware group containing all your nodes. Now, to keep in line with redundancy, I don't want to, even though I want them all running the same version, I never would want to upgrade them at the same time. So that's where our maintenance groups come in. So when I create a maintenance group, very commonly we'll see one called evens, one called odds. So for my node IDs in this group, I would go 102, 104, 106, and then probably have 202 and 204. Now, do I want this on a schedule, or do I want to kind of leave it and just do it on demand? So again, I can see my daily schedule, but odds are I'm probably not going to do an upgrade every single day. So I would leave that blank, and I can just kick it off on demand. So now as I created that first one, I can see I've got now a new group called evens. Well, I'm going to create one more for all of my odds. So I create another group. This one I'll call odds. This one would be 101, 103, 105, 201, 203. So now I can see that all my nodes are divided. Now where this comes into play is assuming that I did have a firmware group that said, maybe I want to run version 11.2. A new version's just come out. I've uploaded it. I would set the firmware group to 11.2. Now that actually hasn't kicked off anything yet. All I've done is set the preference. If I actually want to push that upgrade, I would then come to one of my maintenance groups, right-click on it, and then go upgrade now. And I can kick that off. Or I can set it up to a schedule, like a one-time trigger. Perhaps I want to kick it off at 3 in the morning when I've gone home. Typically, we like to watch our upgrades happen so I can do it on demand and do an upgrade now. So good practice there. Have your multiple groups so you don't kick off things too much there. So in terms of day one, really we've just done a bunch of things here. We've discovered our fabric. We've gone through and set up an Npp source. We've made sure we've got all the controllers all connected, all online. And then usually you want to look at your firmware just to make sure that it's up to date. When you buy these, sometimes they come a couple versions behind. So if there's any new features or potential bugs you're curious about being fixed, just have a look and set these up from day one. And of course, setting up your export policy is very important so you can back up and restore as needed, or you can export diagnostic information if and when needed.